Okay, so we've covered kind of the overall history of institutions surrounding land in the US. And basically, what happens is the US steadily moves westward, taking land from the indigenous population, either by treaty or by force, throughout its history. And then it has policies around this land essentially to encourage small scale ownership. Essentially, its whole history, and we see those very high rates of land ownership around the turn of the century, even moving into the present, where the U.S. has a relatively high home ownership rate. Kind of leading to those kind of zoning problems that we have in the present, which discourage density in our most successful cities. And so, what I want to close with is just kind of going through some interesting episodes of land and property rights in U.S. history. The first being the gold rush, which will be there's a reading that I've assigned um, by Umbeck that really covers this very interesting episode of the California Gold Rush. Those initial period of the California Gold Rush, where there's essentially no government. I mean, this is just literally the wild west, where there's no government, free for all for the gold. People just they can't. The government. I mean, as the article covers, the government can't keep soldiers there because the soldiers will just desert and join the miners. You can't keep people in the cities because everyone's like running to these gold fields. Now, what is fascinating is without a formal government, how property rights and contract enforcement really all emerge. And so the article covers it in depth, but really we have transferable contracts. I mean, it's not as violent as you would think, or as depicted in movies. It's fairly nonviolent and it's fairly orderly system of kind of property rights that emerge just by themselves. So you have a reading covering that. Another interesting California episode, and this is really an example of very poorly defined property rights hindering an initial period of growth. So after the Mexican-American War, the U.S. gets California. The U.S. essentially, wins California or Mexico cedes California to the U.S. Now there's a relatively small population of existing Mexican landowners, and then there's the Catholic Church, and then of course the Native Americans, which unfortunately historically their land rights not respected neither by the U.S. nor Mexico. So the question is what to do with the existing landowners. Now, again, this is the Mexican system, so there's very, very large tracts of land that these families are holding, and the record keeping is not as good. Neither are the border. I mean, these are very large tracts of land, so the borders are ill-defined. It's unclear who owns what, and it's a small number of households. Okay, now here are essentially these are the land grants to those Mexican elite families right before the Mexican-American War. So you can see them, primarily on the good land in California. Now, by 1850, most of the land has been transferred to Americans by sale. Essentially, it's bought. The Mexicans are bought out. And essentially the land had, really gone up in value because, okay, there's gold rush, there's statehood, but there are still several landowners left. And really, the government has to decide, what are we going to do here? Are we just going to take this land? Are we going to buy it from them, like forcibly buy, which we see later? We see later episodes of this in many of your land reform acts in Asia post World War II, where there's like a large land owning elite class, and the governments want to move from large land holdings to small land holdings, and so they force the large landowners to sell. Sorry. So they essentially buy at whatever rates they determine are fair, often at below market values in that case. So the government kind of has these options. Okay, we just take this land. We can just essentially adopt the same policy that we have adopted towards the indigenous population. We just forcibly take it. we can buy it. We can say, hey, you have to sell it to us at these prices, or you could try to recognize the existing land ownership claims. They essentially choose the third option. They try to recognize the land ownership of the existing Mexican landowners. Each and every person claiming lands in California by virtue of any right of title derived from Spanish or Mexican government shall present the same together with such documentary evidence and testimony of witnesses. So, I mean, essentially, they tried to do kind of this system, but it's really, really difficult to adjudicate these land claims because of the poor record keeping, because of squatting, and so on average, each case takes 17 years. Okay, 794 cases, 92 go to the Supreme Court. So you have this weird period in California history post the Mexican-American War where you have these rather large land holdings that nobody's really sure who owns it. Okay, you have like maybe the Mexican family who's there, and they're not sure if the rights are going to be recognized. They're squatters. And so really this is a tragedy of the commons because no one really knows if these things are going to be recognized. Eventually most of them are, but during this initial period, you're hesitant, if you're the existing landowner, to make investment in the property because, okay, you don't know if it's going to be recognized. At the same time, people who are like, don't know if it's going to be recognized or not. So they're kind of squatting on the land, or, there's overuse of the resources on the land, via the wildlife. Cause it's like, okay, well, we don't really know who owns it. So we might as well take as much as we can. So there's really this climate of uncertainty surrounding those initial couple decades in California about who really owns that land. And it really hinders the initial California growth. So you have California that really, California has all these natural advantages, where, obviously the weather's great. It has gold. It has lots of oil too. It has these great harbors. I mean, the San Francisco harbor is like, one of the best harbors, natural harbors in the world. Not to mention, LA has a nice harbor. San Diego has a great harbor too. Actually, San Diego's harbor is much better than LA's. Why LA became the hub of Southern California is a story for another day. Or a story for later in this week, actually, or later in this semester or quarter. Sorry, late at night. Late at night when I'm recording this Saturday. This is my Saturday night. This is what I do on a Saturday night. Record the lecture. Anyways, so it's like you think that California is kind of primed to become this economic powerhouse. Now, of course, it becomes economic powerhouse, sixth largest of the economy in the world, whatever, hub of both the film and tech sectors, all that. But its initial development was really hampered by, hey, we can't, we have to adjudicate these land claims, and it really starts to take off until the back half of the 19th century. And then when the film industry comes here in the early 20th century, then it really starts to grow very rapidly. Okay, another period, and so the Georgia forcibly removes the Cherokee and the Creek from their land here, and then interestingly, they decide to just give away the land to the European settlers via a lottery system. So this is like a massive transfer of wealth. And again, one of the podcasts covers this period, this interesting distribution of land. And then our last one is the Oklahoma land rush, which is just an absolute crazy story. If you're familiar with it, basically, the U.S. is forcibly removing the Native Americans from their land, throughout the 1700s, 1800s, and kind of reserving Oklahoma as Indian territory. We're saying, look, this is an area for the Native population. There's a spot in the middle of it that's unassigned, and so the white settlers are agitating to settle on this land for about a decade, and then the government finally acquiesces and says, okay, this land, we're going to open it up via the Homestead Act in 1889, and they essentially say it's going to be opened up at noon. And so there's this mad dash to run in from the borders and claim the land, and essentially, like, Oklahoma cities really pop up, literally overnight. So the nickname the Sooners comes from people who kind of had snuck in there, previously, before they were supposed to kind of stake out the land claims. All right, so that's just some interesting land episodes in U.S. history, as I mentioned, just to kind of cap off the overall thrust of the institutions surrounding land in the U.S. So the U.S. has strong property rights over land, essentially throughout its sister. Initially those rights are only extended to European settlers. In the present, largely extended to most of the population. Although, of course, if you familiar with civil forfeiture, there is a still differential application of the institutions of property rights around land. All right, that'll do it for this week.